Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Columbia. My name is David Sandalo. I'm the inaugural fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia. We are delighted to welcome this tremendous panel here to talk about the Paris Climate Agreement, which is obviously being signed in New York on Friday after being adopted in Paris last December by more than 190 nations. We have a tremendous group here. For all of you watching on the web, welcome. You can ask questions by using hashtag CGEP events. That's Center on Global Energy Policy Events, CGEP events, and our Twitter handle is at Columbia U Energy. We're delighted to be joined here as well by our founding director, Jason Bordoff. Thank you, Jason, for all your leadership of the center. And we're just going to get going here. Our format today, we have remarks from our panelists, starting with keynote remarks by His Excellency Dr. Thani Al-Zayouti. We're particularly honored to have you here, Your Excellency. Dr. Al-Zayouti is the Minister of Climate Change and Environment for the United Arab Emirates. There he leads the team tasked with representing the UAE interests internationally in energy and climate. He has a long and distinguished career working in the energy and climate field and has a PhD in strategy program and project management at Schema Business School in France. Dr. Al-Zayouti.
Good morning, all. It's really my pleasure to be with you here today at Columbia University, and I would like to express my sincere thankful and gratitude to Mr. David Sandalo and the team here at the School of International and Public Affairs for inviting us to be here today with you and speak about the UAE efforts when it comes to climate change and environment. This Friday, inshallah, the UAE will join the other countries to be the first to sign the Paris Climate Agreement. And we do so proudly with conviction that the agreement will empower us to achieve continued and sustainable economic growth within the country. I want to spend some time here today and talk to you about why Paris was such a great success for us, for the UAE, and why the UAE as a country whose the entire developments and success so far has been thanks to the hydrocarbon is fully supportive of the Paris Climate Agreement. Simply because the Paris Agreement will empower the UAE to follow its ambitious agenda of economic diversifications and green growth. By way of background, the UAE is a young and relatively small country. Established in 1971, we are less than 45 years old. But we have seen massive growth and transformations in only one generation. Our GDP has been growing almost 27 times since 1975, making us a leading global economy. This growth has largely been supported by the revenue from the hydrocarbon, oil and gas mainly, which the country has systematically reinvested the revenue from the sector in the economic diversifications and preparing for approaching the post-oil era. These efforts have paved the way for a strong growth in momentum in the non-hydrocarbon economy, driven primarily by a solid performance in trade, financial services, tourism, logistics, communications, manufacturing, and many others. However, the UAE rapid economic developments has meant for the country is facing serious environmental challenges that arise from a record of population growth, energy and water demand rise, and fast-paced urban developments. I'll give you quick examples about the numbers within the country. On the capita basis, the UAE energy, water, and hydrocarbon footprints are considered very high because of this. Because of the hot and dry climate requires a high amount of energy and high consumption of water and imports of goods that cannot be produced in the country. Our natural freshwater sources are extremely limited, and the government is increasingly resorting to desalinated water, which has been produced using excess heat from electricity generation. While we are reliant on fisheries as main source of diet, stress on marine habitat is increasing. Per capita waste generation is also high within the country. However, it's precisely these pressures have motivated our governments to take effective policy actions and develop comprehensive strategies to manage and to preserve the environments and to protect the biodiversity and our ecosystems. Importantly, these strategies created a new economy and social returns, including more jobs, more opportunities, and ultimately prosperity. For us, climate action represents unprecedented opportunity to diversify our economy and fortify the UAE's economy for future generations. Our focus has been to develop solutions that both reduce emissions and create new economic and social opportunities. Climate change for us and sustainability has now become a key pillar of our national vision and strategies, in particular the UAE Vision 2021, which aims to make us one of the best governments in the world. Our green growth strategies sets the framework for our sustainable growth. It will help us create almost 160,000 new jobs by 2021 and will boost our GDP by 4 to 5%. It does this by setting a holistic direction for the country's long-term developments through diversification into new sectors and improving the performance in all sectors. Specifically, we are focusing on 9 sectors: oil and gas, energy, including water and electricity, industry, building, construction and real estates, transportations and logistics, waste management, land use and agriculture, financial services, and tourism and hospitalities. We're also trying to innovate and find new and creative solutions. Last year, the UAE announced the theme of the year, which was Year of Innovation, and our leadership announced 300 billion dirhams, which is around 80 billion US dollar, specifically to foster knowledge, economy, and innovation to prepare the UAE for a world after oil. A large part of this investment will be focused on developing alternative energy, with almost 128 billion dirhams allocated to investments in clean energy projects and another 72 billion towards renewables. So what does this mean in the context of Paris Agreement? Paris Agreement has created a flexible structure which invites all countries to develop and submit individual plans on how to reduce actions. This focus on nationally determined action is now the mindset, and it's the greatest reason for the Paris Agreement success, as it comes with a promise that countries will be able and contribute climate action in ways which don't compromise their economic growth. For us, for the UAE, our NDCs was one of the most ambitious and sets a solid base for us to increase the ambition as it's required, which include our 24 clean energy targets by 2021. And I can assure you that by 2021 we'll be achieving more than 30% with the new calculation and the evaluation. Efficiency improvements, adaptation efforts. Moving forward, our next 4 years negotiation are going to focus on detailing the rules and procedures to ensure that we have a robust transparency framework, which will be able to help us aggregate these efforts and tell us how they are meeting the 2 degrees goals. The UAE truly believes that the agreement will empower us to achieve our national vision for economic diversifications and green growth. And I'm really proud of the movements within the governments after the restructuring of the governments and adding the climate change as one of the main mandates to the new Ministry of Climate Change and Environment. And for the last 2 months, we've been able to move quickly within the work of the climate change by doing the benchmark as situation analysis, which is going to be announced very soon. And then we're going to detailing the next step when it comes to the UAE climate change strategies and policies. Very soon we're establishing a National Council for Climate Change and Environments to look after the 15 years vision of the country in this sector and see how can we bring the private sector and the academia on board to help us moving forward and preparing the country for the era post-oil period. We're really proud of the international organization that we have within the country, and namely the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA. I know Mr. Adnan is going to speak more about the organization later, but we really, as a country, in the last 6 years, we managed to send a different signal to the world that, yes, a hydrocarbon-based economy can bring an international organization and manage to bring it to the international standards and support the world when it comes to clean energy. So we're, with the new technologies, we're looking at the future, and we're going to always support any new green economy initiatives. Moving forward, we want our economy to be the test case and benchmark to show how this flexible framework can lead to innovative and diversified approaches, which will both reduce emissions and adapt to climate change, but will create new economic and social opportunities. Thank you so much, David. Thank you so much for your attendance here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Al-Zayudi, and thank you for your leadership and your country's leadership on these issues. I'm now honored and delighted to introduce Adnan Amin, who is the Director General of the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, currently serving his second term. In only 5 years under Dr. Amin's leadership, IRENA's membership has tripled, growing to over 170 countries currently. Prior to joining IRENA, Mr. Amin served in a number of senior positions in the UN system. He is, by training, a development economist specializing in sustainable development. We're delighted to welcome him to Columbia.
Thank you very much, David. And let me say, this is my first time to be in this august institution. So while I know you and Jason very well over the years, first time I'm formally here. And what a pleasure it is. Because of our colonial heritage, we had British education, and we are trying to overcome that now by exposing ourselves to a more open academic environment in the US. So great pleasure to be here. I think with a view to talking about the issues you raised, I've been in the international field and following the climate discussion for 15, 16 years. And I think that we reached a very significant moment with Paris. And if you look at it both from the international relations and political perspective, it's an outcome that really addressed a situation where we were at an impasse with no possibility of going forward. We got used to environmental agreements over the previous 2 decades that were on specific issues, that were normative, that were top-down, and that created a binding legal framework. So when it came to an issue like ozone, which was a very clear issue, and we had a financial mechanism attached to it, the success of the ozone agreement is something everybody talks about. But if you look at the climate negotiation, it's about economics, it's about society, it's about politics, it's about distribution, it's about agriculture, it's about health, it's about energy, it's about virtually everything you can think of, and now new things like loss and damage and new concepts in the international space that are coming in. And to have a top-down legal agreement of the type we saw with chemicals or with hazardous waste or with ozone in the climate setting, in my view, is virtually impossible. So we went around the bush having rather difficult discussions for a few years until some new light began to emerge on how do we do this. And I think Paris is the beginning of a new paradigm of how you bring together normative imperatives with an action agenda where there is a high and reliable commitment by countries at the very highest level to take those actions without necessarily having a binding legal framework. And that in the past wouldn't have given much confidence, but after Paris, I think there is a sense of confidence that this can happen that we haven't seen for a long time. And I think that is the real significance of what came out of Paris. And French diplomacy, which we all admire, a little haphazard sometimes, but comes through when it's really required, and Paris was a triumph for the management of the political process with the French diplomats that ran it. So what does this mean in terms of how we go forward? So we have this concept of the action agenda. We had a beginning in Lima talking about what things could actually be done practically, how people could come around this agenda. And that in Paris, we brought that to fruition. And there is a very high expectation that the issues around the Lima, Paris, and now Marrakesh action agenda, I understand the acronym is going to get longer every year, is now providing a perspective for us to really begin to bring different groups of countries together on specific deliverables with a commitment to make that happen. And I think this is remarkable. Now, from our perspective, dealing with renewable energy, as David said, our agency is 5 years old, but we've had remarkable growth every year. And part of it is due to the nurturing environment we have in the UAE. Sigmar Gabriel, the Vice Chancellor of Germany, recently visited, and he was heading the German campaign to bring IRENA to Germany. We had a long discussion. Thani was there, in fact, in a different capacity. And he said to me at the end of it, he said, you know, I was not happy when we lost it, but it was the right decision because I can see IRENA being here gives a signal that wouldn't have been the same coming out of Bonn. Now, just to give you a sense, Thani has talked about the details, but what really struck me, and I'm very close to the UAE decision makers on many of these issues, but what really struck me about their commitment and the level that commitment is, every year in Dubai we have the government summit. The government summit is the one summit where the leadership of the UAE actually in public talks about their future strategy, policy, and how they see the evolution of their country. So the year before last, I was sitting in the audience listening to Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, who outlined his vision for the future, and he's a very powerful decision maker in the UAE setting. And one thing he said really stuck with me. He said, you know, we built the success of our country on hydrocarbons, but we know that the future is going to be different. And we should think ourselves, how will we feel when we export our last barrel of oil? And he says, I'll tell you how we will feel. We will feel good because we will know that we will have done everything that we are doing now to build a sustainable future for our economy. We'll have diversified our economy. We'll have added new productive sectors. We will have a capital base that allows us to invest in strategic areas. And we will be happy that we are no longer dependent on one resource. That's the kind of vision you're seeing emerging, and that's the kind of engagement that we need to find among different countries in different coalitions of action that can make this happen. So last thing, I know we don't have too much time to talk about this, but the last thing is what's happening with energy. Energy is such an important strategic issue for countries that sovereignty in decision-making overrides international cooperation almost every time. And you can understand that. That's why we don't have a universal UN organization on energy. There's never been an agreement to do that. That's why we have energy institutions that are either regionally or politically very specific in different settings. We're the first international organization with a universal capability, but in one sector of energy, which is renewables. And why has it grown like this, and why is it so important today? Because energy accounts for 2/3. Energy production, distribution, consumption accounts for almost 2/3 of carbon emissions. We have a closing window for limiting emissions. If we don't do something in terms of mitigating carbon from our energy system, we will never reach the ambition of 2 degrees, let alone remaining at 1.5 degrees above in terms of temperature increase. The really exciting thing about all of this is that the movement that you see in the renewable energy field is truly revolutionary. And it's just the last 5 or 6 years that this has happened. In 2014, we had the news that renewable energy, after 7 years of investment, had become a $1 trillion industry in terms of total investment in renewables. Every year since then, new investment has been either at around $300 billion a year or above, and we are going to achieve that same $1 trillion of increase that we did in 7 years in 3 years. And with the cost declines that we are seeing in renewable energy technology cost, 80% decline in solar costs over the last 5-6 years, 40% in wind. Geothermal and hydro are already among the most competitive forms of energy that you can have in a system where the potential is good. Those cost declines are going to drive further investment in renewables, and renewables, especially when it replaces hydrocarbons in the power mix, is the strongest way we have to decarbonize. And our sense is, after having studied this in 47 odd economies with national experts looking at the potential for decarbonization, we believe that if we can double renewable energy by 2030 in the global power mix, and we can double the rate of energy efficiency by 2030, we have a very strong fighting chance to remain below 2 degrees centigrade in terms of temperature increase. The good thing is that the business case is here. 160 countries now have targets. This was about 50 countries only 5 or 6 years ago. If you look at the INDCs that came to Paris, we had 190 countries, was it, with INDCs?
187 at the time of Paris.
188.
One more recently,
Yes,
last week.
188. 90% of them have included renewables in the INDC. A large majority have included efficiency. And when we look at the trends of investment, we look at the reduction in costs, and we look at the decarbonization potential on the basis of a positive business case that generates prosperity, economic growth, and employment at a time of economic uncertainty, we have the possibility really to address this in a positive way through the coalitions of actors, of countries that deal with technology, finance, policy, coming together to make this happen. Last point is that what happened in Paris was also significant from this point of view, because a number of initiatives were announced. We were involved in the Global Geothermal Alliance. I'm going, in fact, from New York to Iceland. I understand it's slightly colder. To have the International Geothermal Conference, which is chaired by the President of Iceland, where all the actors will be there. We see huge potential for geothermal ahead. We had the announcement of the Breakthrough Coalition, the Innovation Mission Innovation. We had a whole host of initiatives that were announced in Paris that, if we see them coming to fruition in the coming years, will be transformational in terms of the energy systems that underpin our development in the future. So I think we are at a very optimistic point, but we cannot sit on our laurels. We have to make sure that we seize this opportunity, we develop a positive engagement at the international level and a sense of opportunity at it, and more than that, it cannot be only a state-led process anymore. I'm saying that as somebody who believed this was possible a few years ago. We have to have new actors, we have to have the private sector, we have to have academia and different interest groups at the table, making sure that we are making the right decisions for the future in the short time that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Adnan. I think we'll follow your lead and sit down as we talk. So that's comfortable for you,
Did you want me to
Delphine.
stand up? Sorry.
No. I was prepared to be very formal, but it's much better to be informal like this. We'll turn to Delphine Errault, who is the Senior Policy Advisor on Climate Finance in the French Ministry of Environment, Energy, and Sea, part of the COP21 presidency team, whose praises Adnan was just singing. She's been involved in international climate change negotiations for the past 8 years. Before that, she worked in the private sector for Climate Change Capital, for a startup called Poweo, and she's a graduate of the Harvard Business School. She's overcome the handicap of a Harvard degree to go on to a very successful career, so congratulations. The floor is yours.
Thank you, David, and good morning to all. Thank you very much to Columbia and you, David, for having me this morning within this panel. It's very exciting to be here in New York 2 days before the signing of the Paris Agreement. And actually, we expect already a success. I mean, over 160 countries will be signing, and Minister, you will be among them. Close possibly to 170 countries. So this is a record participation. We had a record participation at the political level in Paris, but yet this again is a record in itself. It's very promising. A few countries will even be submitting their instruments of ratification. So what I wanted to maybe go back this morning on what happened in Paris. I mean, you heard already the effect and some of the consequences already, but maybe from my perspective as COP21 presidency, I think the agreement itself was a turning point. In effect, I mean, it has been said, but it's a universal agreement. It was delicately balanced politically. And it's really, I think many of the negotiators are here in the room, but it was, I think, beyond our expectations in terms of ambition. We knew going forward that there was the political will to get an agreement, but to get this level of ambition during the COP itself was a big achievement. And let me maybe go through some of the key features of the agreement. I don't know to what extent you are familiar with it. I mean, first of all, the countries prepare their INDCs, the national plans. We heard about the EUA. And that's very different from what had happened before. We had, as I was mentioning before, we had up to Paris, we had 187 countries who had already presented their INDCs. Again, that's universal participation. Every country is taking action. But what is also a key features of the agreement, which was one of the achievements during the COP itself, was to get the ambition mechanism. What is the ambition mechanism? It's a commitment of countries to every 5 years revisit and submit new plans, new NDCs, and with a principle of progression. So this ensures increased ambition over time. And also, every 5 years, we will have a global stock take where all the countries take stock of where we are collectively against the 2-degree target. Again, I mean, this is a way to increase the ambition. What was also remarkable was that it sets, the Paris Agreement sets clearly the direction of travel. It takes a longer view. It sets the objective to limit the increase in temperature at 2 degrees and make efforts to 1.5 degrees. It also says very clearly that there should be a zero carbon emissions in the second half of the century and a peak as soon as possible. Again, this is the long-term view that is provided beyond the INDCs themselves. But what was also important is the important role that was given to the adaptation and the recognition to the adaptation. This is something that the issue of the adaptation was elevated in the agreement, and this is something which was very new. Then we had the finance issue. That was one of the key political issues, and I've been working more specifically on this issue. In the Paris Agreement, not only the agreement sets a direction, a transformational goal, that there should be a reorientation of flows, so that's again the direction of travel, but also the developed countries commit to continue to provide support to developing countries, and there had been the goal of $100 billion per year for 2020. This goal was extended to 2025, and beyond there is the commitment that there will be a new goal, a new quantitative goal that will be from this floor of $100 billion, and with special attention to the most vulnerable countries. So that's the solidarity element. And finally, I'm really going into the key highlights, not in the details. The final key element is the transparency part, which is part of the accountability of countries. And there again, I mean, we are moving collectively towards a common framework and an enhanced framework for transparency, not only for the mitigation part, but also for the support. So that's very important. So those are the key highlights of the agreement. But as was said before, not only we achieved this very ambitious agreement, but also the whole action agenda was extremely important. And there again, I mean, there was a record mobilization. There were 70 initiatives and coalitions, only the major one. I mean, there were many more. 10,000 stakeholders involved. You mentioned a few ones. I mean, I could also mention, for instance, the financial, the decarbonization portfolio coalition, which I think has been presented many times to Colombia, with that surpassed, its commitments there with 600 billions of divestment from 25 investors. So many more initiatives. And to answer to your point, I think this action agenda part, which was really one of the strategic decision of our presidency from the onset, to have it and to grow it by Paris. It will from now on be embedded in the Paris Agreement itself, because the Paris Agreement plans to have annual events, to have champions that will nurture those initiatives. So that's a very important part as well. So where do we go from there? We will have, of course, the legal part, which is first the signing that takes place, and it will on the 22nd of April. That's opening. It will be remained open for a year, and the agreement itself will take effect when there is the threshold of 55 countries representing 55% of global emissions that present their instruments of ratification of acceptance. Now, the way it's going, we anticipate that there could be an earlier entry into force of the agreement, and possibly 2017 or 2018. I mean, nobody knows precisely yet, but this is much earlier than what we anticipated in Paris. So that's very, and this is very positive for the political momentum of action. Then the second part, which will continue, is the work program, because in the Paris Agreement, I mean, more details need to be worked on, and this is the plan for this year, with UNFCCC session in May that will start its work program, and of course the Marrakesh COP in November. Already, I mean, we had last year, we organized as presidency a meeting with 50 negotiators, and we had this, Paris spirit was back. I mean, the countries are really focusing on the implementation. I mean, we are no longer in a negotiation, but on implementation mode, and this is very important. And finally, the next key part is really the action. I mean, the action needs to not only continue, but even accelerate, because of course, I mean, even though in Paris we achieved an ambitious result, we are not yet on the path to the 2 degrees. We are more on the 3-degree path at the moment. So we need to really accelerate, and you've provided us some of this direction on the energy. And as Christiana Figueres says, I mean, Paris was not easy, but the hard time, the hard part begins now, right? So I invite you, all of you, in your capacity to participate in this acceleration of the action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Delphine. Particular delight to introduce Joe Aldi, who's the Associate Professor of Public Policy at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, visiting fellow at Resources for the Future, faculty research fellow at National Bureau of Economic Research, faculty chair of the Regulatory Policy Program, the Center for Business and Government, and most importantly, a non-resident fellow right here at the Center on Global Energy Policy. Joe's research focuses on climate change policy, risk evaluation. He has a distinguished career in government. He served as Special Assistant to the President and the White House staff from 2009 to 2010. Joe and I are friends of almost 20 years, which is kind of remarkable. We worked together in the Clinton White House, where he was called Super Joe because of his prodigious analytic and computational abilities. Joe, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, David. I think you've aged better these past 20 years than I have. Your hair looks the same since the time we worked in the Clinton White House, and I'd like to think I had a little more hair back then. Let me also thank Jason and his team here at the Center for hosting this event and for hosting my visit here to Columbia. I think when we look at and reflect on what came out of Paris, it's important to recognize that we are taking a different approach. We're building a new framework, what I think we hope will be a durable and effective framework. Sometimes it's been described as pledge and review, and there's already been some discussion here in the comments about the nature of the pledges, the truly unprecedented scope of the pledges, the nearly universal submission of mitigation contributions by the countries of the world, the debate on whether it's sufficient for limiting warming to 2 degrees or well below 2 degrees C. And I think that's important. I think it's been a large part of the debate in the run-up to Paris and since Paris. But I think if we're going to be successful in tackling the problem of climate change, it's because we're going to really build the policy infrastructure and the institutions for the review part of pledge and review. And by building a really effective system of review, of transparency, of policy surveillance, I think we're going to create the incentives for countries to really ramp up ambition over time. I think when one looks over the history of the Framework Convention on Climate Change going back to 1992, transparency has not been a priority issue. In fact, I would say before the Copenhagen negotiations of 2009, the track record on climate in terms of transparency and review was quite poor, and actually stands in contrast to what we've seen in other international fora, whether it's trade under the World Trade Organization or the Article 4 consultations that the IMF does, that these were sort of a higher quality expert review, much more engaged peer review, and an opportunity to learn more about, say, economic or trade policy and learning what's really effective public policy we haven't really seen in the climate context. I think what was agreed to in Paris in terms of the transparency mechanism, I think can give one hope that we're going to transition into a much more rigorous, robust approach to transparency, that there'll be these opportunities to learn from each other, to learn what works in specific economic, cultural contexts, that you can then export to other countries as they try to identify policies to deliver on the goals that they set forth in Paris, that we may be able to identify and establish metrics of effort so that countries can look at each other, look among their peers, and develop confidence the countries are actually delivering on what they pledged going into Paris. I think this is important. I'm sensitive to this as someone who has worked in the US government, where at times the US government has said it would do certain things on climate policy and then not when one looks at what was agreed to in Kyoto and then not actually ratify the agreement and participate in it. And I think it's important though when we look forward and how we sort of think about ramping up this ambition, how we inform this sort of global stock taking where we identify ways in which countries might be able to ramp up and submit even more ambitious contributions down the road. That's going to be more likely if we've established the trust and the credibility that a rigorous transparency regime can deliver. And in fact, I think what's important is that if we have this well-functioning system of transparency, it's not just something that will satisfy negotiators or maybe ministers. I think it's something that can actually inform the debates that we will have in our respective countries with our domestic publics, those that may have reservations about climate policy, certainly when we look here in the US, but the US is not alone. There are those who are concerned that efforts to take on climate change may adversely affect some of our business interests, especially those that are large energy consumers of the goods they manufacture. But if we have a system of transparency where the US and other countries can say to their domestic publics, we took a step forward, we implemented meaningful policies to mitigate our emissions, and we can look among our peers, our regional neighbors, our trade partners, those we engage with in a wide array of international issues, and they've also taken steps. You know, we look to our left and our right, and we're all moving forward together. We're able to sort of convince ourselves through a system of transparency that that's happening. We're able to demonstrate to various stakeholders in our domestic audiences, as well as those around the world, that we are all moving forward and delivering on what we pledged to do. I think that makes it that much easier. I think it builds the kind of confidence to secure an even more ambitious set of contributions to mitigate emissions as we move forward in implementing this Paris framework. So I think it's important when we assess, are we actually up to the challenge of limiting warming to 2 degrees C? Anyone who's making the determination just on the pledges that were made in Paris, I think you're judging the deal much too soon. I think if we're able to develop and implement a rigorous system of transparency that builds the support for ramping up ambition over time, we'll see the true legacy and the true success of Paris and the successfully more ambitious mitigation pledges in the future.
Thank you, Joe. So I have one question I want to ask specifically to Dr. Al-Zayudi, and then I have some more general questions for the panel as a whole. But I was struck, Your Excellency, as you were talking about the leadership of the United Arab Emirates on these issues, on climate change and clean energy. And I find people who have not visited UAE are often surprised by the leadership of your country on this issue. You're, after all, you're OPEC country. You're oil exporter. How did this happen? How did the UAE become such a leader on these issues, and why is this such a priority?
Thank you, David. Actually, the conservation of our environment began during the establishment of the nation in 1971. His Highness Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan, the founder of UAE, forced everyone to put the environmental aspect as one of the key pillar of any project development within the country, and he was pushing very hard for water conservation since the 70s. He knows that this is going to be very scarce source in the future. So from that day, he started pushing for the environmental aspects. With the time, with the development of the nations, we paid more and more attention to the environment and to our resources. And in early 2005, we started the renewable energy and the clean energy sector era within the country. Basically, because we're looking at this sector as one of the futuristic sectors. It's very promising. We know that it's going to be an economical sector very soon, and we don't want to be very late. So we took it from there, and we started both the peaceful nuclear program as well as the renewable energy. And we, in 2009, we competed against Germany to host the headquarters of IRENA, and everyone in in the region was questioning the way that we're aggressively moving toward the renewables. A few years later, everyone went back and said, yes, what the UAE did from our region was the right approach. Yes, they're looking at the future. We should not continue depending on one economical source, because by that you're going to be depending on the various external factors which can affect your economy and your future plan. At the same time, I want to say this. For now, we're not using 100% our hydrocarbon resources and hydrocarbon reserves. We're only using almost 1/3 of our hydrocarbon reserve, and the rest are kept for our future generation. Yes, we're thinking about 50 years from now to see how we're going to move to the era beyond oil, but we're at the same time we're keeping the reserve for our future generation. We don't want to consume it now. Yes, we want to move ahead and diversify our economy. We want to bring the knowledge and the technology to be the main driver of the sector. When it comes to climate change, we look at the Paris Agreements as one of the tools to achieve that vision, and it's not fair to look only at the energy sector as one of the main polluter or the main source of climate change. Climate change, as Mr. Adnan said, it's very complex. It touches upon all sectors. So if we really want to talk about the opportunities when it comes to climate change, we have to look at each sector and see what are the opportunities and how we can build upon what has been achieved globally, and what are the opportunities for the private sector, for the governments, for the academia, for the NGOs, and move forward. Again, and I know this is the stereotyping, and this is the attitude of most of the negotiators, that everything has to be driven by governments, but it won't. If we're going to continue with the same attitude, we won't achieve anywhere. Everyone has to work together. And what we saw at Paris was the right approach. We all have to sit together and always have to be united to see how can we achieve the ultimate goal of protecting our Mother Earth.
Well, thank you. I thought we'd talk first about the diplomacy and then the technology, and maybe focus on what comes next now that we have this agreement and we're headed forward into a series of COPs in the years ahead. And maybe start with climate finance. I know that's an issue that you've had responsibility for, Delphine. It's a hugely important issue. If we're going to make this transition, we need to mobilize lots of capital. This was a pillar of the climate, of the Paris Agreement. What should we look for in terms of what comes next on the issue of climate finance?
Well, there are, some work that remain to be done under the agreement itself. And the agreement, as I was mentioning, is mostly around the issue of the $100 billion commitment by 2020 by developed countries, and some more transparency work and work on the methodologies will have to be done by the entry into force of the agreement. And actually, this year, the developed countries are expected to provide more visibility on the roadmap to get to this mobilization, which includes also private finance, not only the public finance, by 2020. I mean, this has been a strong, expectation in the negotiation. So that's one part of the work, and also, what is also very important, going back to the implementation of the agreement, is to facilitate the access of developing countries, especially those with the least capacity to this finance. I mean, we have seen already in discussion under the GCF, or even in the informal meeting that I was mentioning with negotiators, that now the countries, as they are looking to turn their indices potentially in bankable projects or to adapt their policies, they need some specific support. I mean, for that. So the issue of access and capacity building is a key priority, and I know the COP22 presidency will make it a priority as well this year. Many commitments, financial commitments, have been made in Paris by governments, financial institutions, private sector, and the follow through on those commitments by COP22 was also be very important. But of course, I mean, this is only one small part of the mobilization, because we know that the public finance is not going to solve the issue. So the private finance mobilization in the range of trillions is what matters, right, for this transformation. So already the agreement itself, beyond this finance section, sends that signal, which is why the signal itself is so important, including to the financial community. We have, through my treasury colleagues, we have also been pushing the agenda on the finance. For instance, I mean, there is some work with the Financial Stability Board on the issue of risk, for instance, in finance, which is very important. So all the things, the divestment, all those things can contribute to drive and mobilize the finance at scale.
Adnan, it's an issue that you're paying attention to at ARENA and looking at how to mobilize the capital that's going to be needed to deploy renewable energy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's critical to do this. And let me say that I think the almost unhealthy focus we've had purely on mobilizing international public finance and building the institutions around that has done a disservice to us in terms of looking at what the real opportunities for scaling are. And, I was at Copenhagen. In fact, I left the UN immediately after Copenhagen and went to ARENA. And Paris was a wonderful thing that happened, changing perspectives after Copenhagen. But in Copenhagen, we were fighting about the 100 billion without any idea of where it was going to come from who, in what time frame, and how it was going to be dispersed. So we had this huge political disagreement around an issue that had very little definition. And we continue to do that. The one institution we've been able to establish, which is the GCF, I don't want to be saying that, these are the wrong things. It has a very important role. But it has pledges of 10 billion. Last year was its first year of operation. Not 1 cent has left the door. They have projects approved of about 118 million, which is a drop in the ocean. And they're talking about ramping up their ability to approve projects. But you have an intergovernmental process of project approval that is so arcane and political that it's almost impossible to try to disperse money for commercially relevant projects out of mechanisms like this. So when we started looking at financing, it became very clear that there are 2 or 3 big opportunities. One is that there is a huge, as Delphine said, there are trillions of dollars in especially institutional investors that are looking for destinations for this money. But we haven't had investment opportunities at scale for renewable energy that have been able to be attractive enough for that kind of volume of financing to come. We don't have the policy frameworks yet in place in most of the emerging economies. Some of them are changing the paradigm every day, but we don't have those enabling frameworks in enough of those economies to enable that to happen with predictability and security. I mean, investors need long-term predictability and security for their investments. And that's where we need to be looking. So what we've done is 2 tracks. One is people say that there's a lot of money, but there are no projects. For the last 2 years, we've been working with project developers, governments, technology companies, technology providers, to look at how we develop pipelines of investment-grade projects in all the emerging economies. So we've started with Africa. We have a pipeline for islands. We're looking at Asia and Latin America. And it is remarkable how many investment opportunities there are, but many of the developers don't have the basic skills to achieve bankability for those proposals. So we've developed the methodology that engages with them to get to that point. So we're building these pipelines. But the other major inhibitor for investment is, apart from the policy frameworks which are improving, is the fact that the cost of financing for renewable energy investment is still too high compared to its record. And we believe that the best role for public financing would not be to sit and quibble about projects of a few $100 million for months and years, but really to use public finance as a possibility for risk mitigation, to develop a risk mitigation mechanism that helps you to draw down the cost of financing of these projects, if we can achieve that. And this 100 billion would be just enough to do that. Thank you very much, Delphine.
Joe, from your perspective as an economist, any thoughts on the climate finance issue?
Well, I think there's 2 basic ways we can push out new technologies. And that is, we can look at it on the supply side and subsidize the deployment of these technologies and think about the potential, maybe primarily with public resources, to buy down the cost and to put out new lower zero carbon energy capital in developing countries. But the other is to create demand for these technologies. And I think that's one thing that's really important about the breadth of the Paris Agreement, that we have now, with almost every country having said, we're going to contribute to mitigation. The next part is to think through what are the domestic policies to make that happen. And for a firm that may have innovative technology, it's not, can I get the support of the GCF or of USAID or some other donor institution to try out once at commercial scale, but it's to say, well, wait, there's now this market that's going to create demand for our technology because the country is now implementing policies aimed at lowering emissions. So I think there's a way in which one can use the donor funds and the public funds to help demonstrate the commercial viability, especially first at the time in some of these countries, but it's the potential for the development of public policy to really create the demand that can sustain that investment and sustain the role of the private sector so that we really see a dramatic ramping up of these technologies in developing countries.
Let me just stick with you for a minute, Joe. You spoke very strongly in your remarks about the importance of the transparency mechanisms going forward, and I wanted to ask whether you see specific criteria that are necessary, or kind of when you look at the negotiations on this topic, what will you be looking for as marks of success? And then I'm interested to bring the panel in on the politics of this going forward as well.
So I think there's one thing I'm interested in from a substantive standpoint and one thing from a process standpoint. And on the substantive standpoint, I think we need to be creative about how we develop and implement metrics of effort. That I think there is a strong domestic interest when one looks at stakeholders, that comparable countries undertake kind of comparable action. And there will be a debate among countries on who should be comparing to who. If you talk to some US stakeholders, they're really concerned about China. I'm not sure that's necessarily who we should be comparing to and having exactly comparable effort, but certainly it's reasonable to think that the US and the EU and Japan would have roughly comparable effort as well. But I think to do that, we need to think through creatively what are the metrics we're going to be looking at that demonstrate that countries are implementing policies to mitigate their emissions. And whether that's looking at some ways of trying to quantify emissions, which I think there's a lot of noise and there's a lot of unrelated factors that could influence how we quantify, what our quantified emissions may be. But looking at, say, measures of energy prices, looking at measures of implementation of climate policies, maybe even carbon prices that a lot of countries have expressed interest in pursuing, that I think those kinds of metrics will reflect a more, I think, sophisticated assessment and understanding of what countries are actually doing, and provides, I think, a richer understanding of what countries are implementing in terms of their policies. From a process standpoint, I alluded to the fact that I think historically the UN Framework Convention's approach to transparency has been weak. It's been, we'll submit a report, maybe we'll be on time, depending on what kind of country you are, maybe someone will review it. Even among those countries whose reports were subject to review among the developed countries, the standards changed from report to report, so it's even hard to compare the US from one national communication to another. I think process-wise, if we have a much more systematic approach of expert review, where we have external experts, and I think the ideal would be sort of a professional experts, not unlike what we have in the IMF or the WTO or the OECD that do their own kind of review systems. But we have the expert reviews that feed into a really thoughtful, engaged peer review, where we're not saying, are we going to penalize you if you didn't live up to this, but we're really trying to understand what has been your approach to implementing your contribution. I think that can actually build the kind of trust that I think is necessary for us at the next round to periodically update and increase the ambition of our efforts. So I think it's both taking a step forward on the substance of transparency than what we've seen before, but also taking a step forward on the process. And we've got, there's a little bit of that coming out of the Copenhagen and Cancun process, but I think it needs to be enhanced going forward if we're really going to see review drive more ambitious pledges over time.
Well, thanks. I want to bring the audience in a minute. For those listening on podcast, my name is David Sandalo. I'm here with Tani Al-Zioudi of the United Arab Emirates, Adnan Amin of ARENA, Delphine Ayrault of the French Foreign Ministry, and Joe Aldi of Harvard. Let's ask about the politics of these negotiations going forward. This agreement was achieved with a remarkable level of head of state attention. That I wonder, can we make progress at the COPs ahead on the types of issues we're talking about without that type of head of state attention, or do you think we're going to see that in the COPs going forward? Does anybody have any thoughts generally on maintaining momentum in these negotiations? Adnan.
Thank you, David. Well, first of all, let me say I agree very strongly with something Joe said, though he's from Harvard, about judging the deal too soon. We saw a rash of articles that came out. We have a 17 gigaton gap. Even if we implement the NDCs, we will only do 2.7 degrees or 3 degrees. You know, I think that is premature because we are not concentrating on the opportunity that the operational agenda brings. And I agree that the review mechanism has to be the driver for this. But let me give you some specific examples from a developing country perspective. We work with energy ministries. Energy ministries set the targets for renewables, they take the investment decisions, they set the policy frameworks. These guys know what they're doing and what they're talking about, because if the electricity is not working, they lose their job, and they know their job very well. The climate negotiation was done by energy ministers, and the INDCs were put together under coordination of environment ministries. Environment ministers know very little about what's happening, apparently, in energy, even in their own countries. Because when we looked at the INDCs, we found that the targets on renewables were below what their national commitments in record already were. Apparently, the people who drafted some of these INDCs for some countries, who set maybe a target for 20% for renewables in the power sector, didn't know they already had a commitment for 40%. Didn't know that some of these processes were already underway. So I think one of the important aspects of the review process will be to drive that kind of intersectoral collaboration and to drive an integrated approach to climate across government. And I think that is essential, and that's the strength of this.
Tanya, I think you have, sorry to cut in, but I think you have responsibilities for both environment and energy in your government. Is that, do you think Adnan's critique is fair? Do you see this in other countries?
I totally agree with Mr. Adnan, and it's happening with so many other governments. Luckily, within the UAE, we're very well coordinated with each other. And even when we submitted the INDC, we established a national task force which looked after the whole initiative of the governments, and we came up with a very comprehensive submission for the nation. Going back to what Mr. Adnan said, to be honest, we in the developing countries, and this is our main challenge, that many of us don't know what exactly we want. And this makes the negotiation very tough. And what he has been talking about, the 100 billion fund last year, and fighting within the rooms and those political negotiations, usually has been done by politicians who have no practical involvements within their governments. And this is which creates the whole confusion and the complexity of the movements forward when it comes to climate change. The upcoming period needs different mindset. We need to look at the opportunities of the Paris Agreement and the opportunities of the various coalitions and initiatives that have been announced. And if we really want to move forward, we need to separate the negotiation from the practicalities and try to push the negotiation toward being more practical rather than being more political and I would say the personal interest rather than the opportunities that can create moving forward.
Let me invite anybody who'd like to come up to the microphone to do so. And Delphine, I know you wanted to come in on this topic.
Very
Yes.
interesting question. I mean, first of all, to say that I don't think the political mobilization is still there, and the signing ceremony this week is a testimony to that, because some people said after Paris, the attention level will decrease. The proof is no, right? And at the same time, I mean, countries are really, from listening to them, are entering a phase where they are either in the process of also reviewing their INDCs and what it means in terms of potentially adjusting their own policies or putting more coherence, because many of them have multiple policies in place, or even looking at how to increase the ambition of their INDCs when they deposit their NDC. We heard last week at the informal meeting in Paris that a few countries mentioned that they were doing that, like Ecuador and Argentina, for instance, right? So I think this INDC process has triggered this implementation phase. I mean, the INDCs are starting in 2020, but already it has triggered some work, and your country is an example of that. So I think that's very important. And just a mention on the GCF, because I happen to be very closely involved as advisor to our French Treasury member who is on the board. I think, the GCF is an important institution under the UNFCCC, but it's still at the early stage. So, there has been a lot of political attention and the pressure to it. Even last year it was under the pressure to approve project in record time, because it is going to disperse money through entities that that it accredits, and it's been accrediting many entities rapidly. So it's a little bit too soon to say it's not yet dispersing. I mean, it's still. I mean, it's working on it to improve and to fasten its procedure, but it's still early days. I mean, it's still, and I can tell you that everybody on the board and in the community is working very hard to make it to improve its functioning.
Jason Bordoff.
Thanks. This is a great discussion. Jason Bordoff from Columbia. I was really interested, Dr. Al-Zayudi, in your discussion. You used the phrase post-oil era. And I just wanted to kind of ask you to say a little bit more about it and how you think about it and how you think about the timing of it. We've heard that idea from multiple, Deputy Prime Prince Mohammed bin Salman also talking about the economic reforms Saudis undertaking, diversifying away from oil revenue. At the same time, countries like the UAE and Kuwait and others are increasing production capacity to produce more oil, investing to do that in the near term. So it seems like one view could be we want to increase energy efficiency because that makes good economic sense and it frees up product for export. We want to lead in renewable energies because there's a big growing market for that. But even if oil demand growth slows or starts to decline, the world's going to be using it for a really long time. We're a low-cost producer, and that revenue is going to be there. The other is more extreme, which is at some point, decade, 2 decades, we don't know how long, we won't get oil revenue anymore because the world will not be using oil. That's a more extreme view, and it also leads to a whole different set of places for how you think about government policy. And I was just wondering if you could talk about how seriously people in the UAE take the idea that actually dependence on oil revenue as a business model isn't going to work very long.
Thank you, Jason. Actually, it's very, very excellent question. The oil and the hydrocarbon is going to continue being a crucial part globally. And this is a fact which we do understand, and we believe that it's going to continue supporting the world regardless which sector we're talking about. If it's not the electricity, it's going to be the transportations. If it's not going to be the transportations, we're talking about the petrochemicals, et cetera, et cetera. So hydrocarbon is going to support us in all the means of our life. But when it comes to UAE and the post-oil era, we're talking about the contribution of the hydrocarbon revenue into our GDPs. And so far, we reached almost 30% of the contribution of the revenue into our economy. And we put another target that the contribution of the hydrocarbon is going to be supposed to be only 20% by 2021. So we're talking about almost 5 years from now. And by 2050, it should be less than that. We want our economy to be not to be volatile with the global prices. We want the economy to be based on the knowledge base. We want our human resources to be the lead of our economy, rather than we're depending only on one single natural resources. And this is the direction which we're taking. The climate change and the establishment of the climate change ministry, or adding the climate change to the environment ministry, it's giving us another boost that we have to look at the private sector and bring it on board. We're looking at the environmental sector as an economical sector rather than an environmental and protection sector. Same thing with the other ministries within the governments. We're taking different approaches than before. Now we have to invest in research and developments. We have to ensure that we have the national capabilities when it comes to science, the private sector's involvements and role, and how we're going to pave the way for the private sector locally and internationally to come and invest within the governments. So those are the steps which we're taking. It's going to take a lot of efforts from our side to reach that target, but it's a tough target which we have to achieve. Looking at the future, we are committed to provide highly style life to our generation and to the future generation. And if we really want to achieve that mission, we have to move toward diversification of our economy, and we have to ensure that the economy is not volatile and it's not resilient to any external factors.
Can I just add to that?
Sure.
I mean, just to add to that, it's very interesting to look at how the oil sector is evolving now in GCC, but in the broader MENA region. We just had a MENA Renewable Energy Conference in Kuwait, hosted by Kuwait. It became very evident that there is a long-term strategy where in the GCC region we have already an agreement on interconnection among all the GCC economies. So regional trade for electricity is now possible. You had some of the lowest cost investment in terms of power generation in Dubai. Remember when we were talking about the 5.8 US dollar kilowatt hour, US dollar cents kilowatt hour in Dubai? It's been exceeded by Peru recently, but the next round is coming in Dubai. Everybody is looking at how they can ramp up their renewables investment at these kind of prices which are competitive with gas, which is the general, in a way that they can conserve their hydrocarbon resources and turn their electricity and power sector towards renewables and have a regulated electricity trade. The North African countries, which have huge potential, led by Morocco and now Egypt, are looking at the possibilities of linking into this. So I think there's a longer-term strategic thinking about the evolution and transformation of energy in the region that underlies the thinking about the oil future also. Because now the discussion is turning to much more what are the higher value-added uses of the hydrocarbon resources for the region rather than just burning it for power generation or for vehicles. And I think that is where the opportunities are.
Thank you. Sir.
Hi, Timothy Chung with Clearview Energy Partners. For a number of political reasons here in the US, I think a lot of supporters of the Paris Agreement might want the agreement to go into effect this year. Perhaps that's more relevant on account of yesterday's results of the New York primary. So I guess the question is, how likely or even possible is it that the agreement could go into effect this year? And if it's not going to be this year, do we have a ballpark on when we think that might actually happen? Thank you.
Delphine. Delphine
Well,
Herrero.
Yes, as I was mentioning a bit earlier, I mean, nobody knows for sure because it depends on the speed of ratification, and the countries have different processes. But as I mentioned, there are two thresholds. For the agreement to go into to take effect, you need to have 55 countries representing 55% of global emissions that present their instrument of ratification of acceptance. And the expectation is that it could happen in 2017, or I mean more for sure in 2018. But the end of 2016 would be really, really difficult. I think.
What is the basic math? So the U.S. and China have committed to,
The US and
will enter into
China-
force this year, and that's what % of global emissions? Do you know?
It's a 38% between the two of them.
So then there's 17% more that would be needed for it to enter into effect. Right?
Canada should ratify this year, potentially Australia. Some seats will be presenting their instruments on April 22nd. We don't know yet with certainty.
Thank you. Bill.
Hi, Bill Spindle from the Wall Street Journal. This is a great discussion. Thanks very much. I just wanted to ask about the Clean Power Plan, which was sort of the Obama administration's exhibit #1 for the U.S. commitment and was used to bring a number of other important countries along. It's in a pretty muddled state right now and probably will continue in a pretty muddled state for a while. How problematic is that in terms of both the sort of clarity of statement in terms of private investment coming in, and also what you were talking about in terms of we're all doing this together? I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Who would like to answer that question?
I could give my take on the U.S. perspective, but it may
Please.
be more interesting to hear the perspectives of those outside the
Well,
U.S.
why don't you start, Joe Aldi?
engaged in the negotiations. I would say a stay of a regulation is difficult to communicate to people inside the United States, and even more difficult to communicate to those trying to observe our political process from outside the United States. And I say that based on my experience in having been in government and been involved in the negotiations. And it's so we have this sort of legal process, we have this sort of stopping the clock on a regulation. If the regulation is upheld by the courts in the next couple of years, I'm not sure that actually changes anything in terms of the implementation timetable, the targets, et cetera. So it's something about how we'll see the courts play out. I think that the stay, which is even more complicated by the fact that we now have an empty seat on the Supreme Court, it's, I think, more important what's going to happen later this year when the appellate court that is hearing the case makes a decision. And if that appellate court strikes down some or all of the Clean Power Plan, I think that sends a potentially adverse signal to the international community that the primary policy that the administration is trying to implement, at least for the power sector, is suffering from legal risk. Now, there are some backstops to that. I think the agreement to continue tax credits for renewable power, wind and solar for another 5 years that came out just at the end of last year is important as a kind of backstop to still get you some of the emission reductions that you would expect with the Clean Power Plan. But it's hard for me to assess that a stay of a regulation before the courts have finally ruled is something that really resonates with those in the international community. If for no other reason, when I've attempted to try to explain it, there's this kind of look of bewilderment of what is this system that you operate in that has yielded this outcome. So I think it's a little premature to say it's really having a chilling effect perhaps on the negotiations. If anything, as has already been alluded to, maybe it's the current political campaign has a bigger chilling effect on where other countries think the U.S. might be going on climate, depending on how things play out this fall. But I don't think where we are now, the stay matters that much. But I'm curious to hear what my colleagues.
Any thoughts from other panelists on this?
Yeah. Can I try?
Please. Adnan Amin.
I try to avoid answering Bill's questions normally, but this is a very interesting one. Because I think I was thinking as Joe was talking earlier about the review mechanism, the transparency, the rigor, everybody doing their bit. I was saying, is the U.S. going to do the same? And this is what everybody's looking for. Everybody's looking in the climate discussion for the U.S. to resume global leadership in one of the key issues affecting humanity in the coming years. We need to see that. And the discussion around the Clean Power Act, I think, is raising question marks in terms of whether, despite the political will of the administration, the U.S. will be in a position to play that leadership role. Everybody is hoping that they will. But there are other aspects to the policy framework which are actually quite positive. The fact that we had an extension for the tax credits for renewables investment had a huge impact. An analyst in Goldman Sachs was telling me that when the climate agreement in Paris was adopted, the impact on the biggest solar company, a listed company in the US, was an increase of its share price of 3%. Some months later, when the tax credit was extended for 7 years, that same company saw an increase in its share price of 20%. And I think this is what we have to look for, because regulation has a very important role. But for the urgency of the issue and its global importance, we have to look beyond regulation into where are the opportunity areas for growth where different political constituencies can come on board. Following this discussion in the US, it's very interesting to me, and I don't live here anymore, but you could correct me if I'm wrong, but that old opposition we had in what you call the red states to renewables and Solyndra and the political football that renewables had become is no longer there because the red states are making a ton of money from renewables investment. So maybe we need to look at those kind of opportunities, and that's where the real leadership of the US could be.
We have time for one more question, and then we will wrap it up.
Hello, my name is Andrew Isle. I'm an independent consultant formerly with the U.S. State Department's Climate Change Office. I wanted to thank the panelists for their stimulating comments and in particular focus on the transparency and review issue that you all were discussing, particularly you, Professor Aldi. I wanted to drill down on that a little bit and ask about the potential for other metrics of progress and success that are not purely driven by emissions and looking at policy metrics and investment metrics. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate on what some of those might be and how there might be uptake of those in the UNFCCC context. Thank you.
And Joe, if you could do that very briefly, because we only have about 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay,
And then I'm going to
so
ask each of the panelists for any quick final comments before we close.
I'll let this do double duty.
Perfect.
And let this be my
And then
closing
we'll come
comment
down
as
the road
well,
this
because I think it's important for us to be creative, thinking through what kind of metrics matter, and I think part of that is just a nature of, as the negotiators come together and think through how we design transparency, it should reflect what we think stakeholders in respective countries think would be important information. And it's more than just, how do we count the tons, which actually is really hard to do. So I think some of it is there are ways in which we can look at policies and say, do you have policies that are actually explicitly pricing carbon? Or some that are implicitly pricing carbon? Can we generate an estimate of that? Do we have, and this is something that was at the beginning of the Paris conference, let's not just think about what we do to mitigate emissions, let's also think about the fact that we need to invest in innovation. And we can look at some metrics of effort there, I think to further demonstrate that we're taking progress and doing more and finding ways to sort of collaborate on that. I think there are ways in which we might look at various kinds of metrics of policy reform. So countries, and we've seen this in other multilateral contexts, have said, we're going to rationalize energy prices. So this is one where, in some countries, putting a price on carbon is less important than getting the prices right on fuels and electricity. And so I think there are ways in which one can sort of tick major policy reforms that we know move one in the right direction of reducing emissions and creating incentives for deployment of low and zero carbon technologies that all could fit into, I think, a more rigorous and sophisticated review process where it's not just, are your emissions above or below the number you said they were going to be? What are you really doing to try to implement that? And in a sense, that should be more important, at least in this first round, than are you above or below that number? Because we want to see if countries are making good faith efforts. We want to see if there's actually some important lessons from policy experimentation that we can take into other countries in other contexts. And if we're able to really deliver on that and tap into, I think, the creativity that reflects all of our interests in constructing these metrics and assessing who's doing what, I think we'll be able to, I think, realize in the true vision of Paris, which is a ramping up of ambition over time.
Delphine, quick
Yeah, I mean,
60-second final comments from each of our panelists, then we'll close.
To complement on that, this is precisely the work that, some of the work that remains to be done after Paris, to go much more into the details. And just maybe to add on this particular point that, for instance, in the French energy transition law, we have a specific provision on financial disclosure, and France is at the forefront on that to precisely ask investors how, among others, how they will be contributing to, it's not written like that, but basically to the Paris Agreement.
Thank you. Adnan.
I think Paris has opened an unprecedented window of opportunity on climate that we haven't seen for many years. The way we take advantage of that is through implementation and taking forward the various initiatives we've already agreed to. If we don't do that, there will be a process of questioning the commitments that are not legal commitments, but political commitments at Paris, which will begin a process of unwrapping. So, number one, focus on implementation, get some of these things happening. The second is it's a moment of opportunity because of what is happening in energy markets. I told you about the meeting in Kuwait. We had a long discussion about the fact that energy subsidies for fossil fuels in the region are leading to suboptimal economic decision making and have actually hindered industrial growth and diversification in those countries. This is a moment of opportunity with low oil prices. Those subsidies are being phased out, and we see this all over the world. If we get to rational pricing and we look at the real cost of use of energy and we internalize the cost, I think we can move to very optimal decision making.
Dr. Tania Al-Zayouti, you were our original inspiration for convening this event. It's been tremendous, so I want to thank you for that. Any final words?
Sure, thanks, David. We've been saying that Paris Agreement was flexible, and actually Paris Agreement is the platform for all governments to build on it and come up with very a promising future for their governments, for their industries, and we have to start. We should not always look at the challenges and the issues. We have to look at the bright side and see that there are huge opportunities for us to continue and work from Paris. I think the global gathering here in New York is another signal after Paris that when we unite, we can send signal to the whole world that we can do it, and we can do it together, not only as governments but also as a human and as people who are living here in the earth. Thank you.
Thank you, and please join me in giving all our panelists a big hand.